An ex-Virginia sergeant and Capitol rioter by the name of Thomas Robertson was found guilty on all 6 charges he faced for his actions on January 6th. And I don't know if Tim Poole is paying any attention to this story. I want to make sure he is. So make sure you draw his attention to this, because he seems to be severely misinformed when it comes to the January 6th riots. We'll get to the details on that in just a moment. But first, here's the context. Robertson faced charges including impeding law enforcement officers, obstructing an official proceeding, entering and remaining in restricted grounds. That's the part I want Tim Poole to focus on, by the way, and tampering with evidence. The jury heard from multiple witnesses during the trial last week, including Washington police officers who were there during the attack, federal agents, and Robertson's former police colleague and co-defendant who testified as part of a plea deal with the government. So Robertson has been awaiting his trial in jail since July, and that's after investigators said that they found a rifle and also bomb-making material in his home. They also learned that he bought another 37 guns on the internet after his original arrest in January of 2021. According to Tim Poole's logic, he shouldn't have even faced any of these charges, because you guys, there were no signs in the Capitol saying that you cannot trespass. Again, we'll get to that in just a minute, but I want that to like marinate in your mind as I give you more details to this story. During the trial, a DC Metropolitan Police officer testified that a man carrying a stick, who prosecutors say was Robertson, hit him and another officer as they tried to pass through the mob of rioters during the attack. Prosecutors played several clips of the incident, including footage from police body cameras worn that day. Prosecutors also cited online posts Robertson allegedly wrote a month before the attack, where he called for an open armed rebellion. The defendant made good on that promise. Assistant U.S. Attorney Elizabeth Alloy told the jury during opening arguments, saying that Robertson used a large stick to impede officers who were called in as backup during the riot. And then finally, some more details on this. Robertson's former Rocky Mount police colleague, Jacob Fracker, testified that Robertson joined him inside the Capitol, took a photo with him, and joined in chanting and cheering with the crowd inside. Fracker also testified that he had given Robertson his cell phone after the pair were told to turn themselves in, and that Robertson had put the phone in a container for ammunition and told him something to the effect of, "Problem solved." And let's keep it real. His defense was pretty weak, maybe because there was so much evidence against him. And in closing arguments, Robertson's attorneys argued that he had no plans to go down and say, "I'm going to stop Congress from doing this vote," and continued to suggest that the stick Robertson had with him was simply a walking stick. That's all it was, guys. It was a walking stick. It's just sometimes he slips and hits others with the walking stick, but it's a walking stick. That was his defense. Pathetic. Now, notably, he had his case heard before a jury. And I think that made all the difference, because Tim Poole had made one of the stupidest arguments in order to provide cover for the Capitol rioters. If you don't remember what that stupid argument was, let me remind you.
A lot of people keep saying trespassing, and I think it's because we're like, they entered this property. But the Capitol is public property. My understanding is that many of these buildings, I'm not sure about the Capitol specifically, are open to the public in most cases. And for a lot of these people, you can watch video of the police opening up the door and saying, "I agree with your right to protest." So these people who walked in and were looking around and like smiling and waving, they were not informed. They weren't allowed to be there. There were no signs. There's no warning. The first thing that has to happen is, "Excuse me, you are trespassing during an official proceeding. You need to leave." "Oh, sorry about that. Bye-bye." But they didn't do that. So I'm wondering if this is even trespassing.
Tim Poole's wondering if it's even trespassing because there were no signs saying that you may not trespass, right? Apparently he missed all of those videos that were littered across the internet showing how cops who had barricaded the building, who tried to block off the building, were overpowered by violent rioters who had attacked them physically in order to get through. Apparently, the entire country was able to see those videos except Tim Poole. Who knows? Maybe the beanie was on too tight. Maybe it was covering his vision, covering his hearing. I don't know. But to watch those videos and make an argument that like, well, the rioters didn't know that they weren't allowed to, storm through police barricades, storm into the building. Some, by the way, defecating on the floor. Like they didn't know. They didn't know that that was wrong. They shouldn't have done that. Now, recently, Tim Poole made the mistake of thinking that he could come after me and Cenk, tweeting this: how it started versus how it's going. Hey, Anna Kasparian, Cenk Uygur, I was right. Imagine getting dunked on as aggressively as Tim Poole was dunked on for that stupid argument, and then turning around to argue, I was right. Were you though, Tim? So as evidence for why he was right, he included a screenshot of this Daily Mail article. The winning Capitol riot defense, blame the cops. Government defense contractor becomes first defendant acquitted of all charges after arguing that officers opened door to Rotunda and let him in. And so the story is about one of the Capitol rioters, Matthew Martin is his name. And his case was a little different from the case that I shared details about earlier, because number one, he happens to be a federal defense contractor. And I'm speculating here, but I would argue that someone who has ties to the federal government as a federal defense contractor maybe gets treated a little differently. And to be sure, his case was treated differently because it was not heard before a jury. Matthew Martin was acquitted by US District Judge Trevor McFadden after a two-day bench trial. Martin, who chose to go to trial in the misdemeanor case before a judge rather than go before a Washington jury. Martin is the first January 6th defendant to be fully acquitted at trial. So let's repeat that last part again. Let's put that graphic up. Let's repeat that last sentence one more time for Tim Poole, who's a moron. Martin is the first January 6th defendant to be fully acquitted at trial. He did not have his case heard before a jury. A Trump-appointed judge was the only individual who made a decision about the future of this Capitol rioter, who again happens to be a federal defense contractor. Martin testified at his bench trial that he didn't see everything that was happening around him during the attack. Apparently he's blind as well. Even though the video he recorded, which was played by the government, shows broken windows and an alarm blaring when he enters the Capitol on the east side after rioters bust open the doors leading to the rotunda. McFadden said, by the way, that the first charge of entering and remaining in a restricted building was a close call. The judge is saying this. He's like, oh, this is a close call. I should probably not acquit you, but I'm gonna do it anyway as a Trump-appointed judge. But that there was reasonable doubt whether Martin knew he was entering a restricted building. Again, you hear the alarms in the video evidence. You can see the chaos around him, but it doesn't matter. He apparently didn't know that he's not supposed to enter that building. Again, shows broken windows and an alarm blaring as he enters the Capitol on the east side after rioters bust open the doors leading to the rotunda. And by the way, another important statistic for Tim Poole, who apparently likes to point to this one specific case to bolster the dumbest argument ever made. The FBI has more than 775 arrests in connection with the January 6th attack. More than 2,500 people are believed to have entered the Capitol that day, and hundreds of others assaulted officers outside the building. So if you're going to point to the one case that seems to be skewed in the favor of this Capitol rioter because of how the case played out, maybe just spare a moment to mention the literal hundreds of other arrests. And more importantly, the several cases that we've already talked about on this show where the perpetrators were found guilty. There's been a lot of that as well.
The first individual who was charged in connection to the Capitol riots has been found guilty of all charges. The name of the individual here is Guy Reffet, and it sets the tone for the rest of the trials moving forward involving Capitol rioters. Now, Reffet decided against taking a plea deal, and his wife is actually still supportive of that decision. We'll get to her in a little bit, but what was he found guilty of? Well, apparently he is not one of the individuals who managed to storm inside the Capitol. However, this Texas man and also member of the 3 Percenters was a supporter of Donald Trump, of course, and he did go to the Capitol on January 6th. He was charged with 5 counts, all of which he was found guilty of, including wanting to obstruct a congressional certification of the 2020 presidential election. Of course, that was the whole point of these riots. Transporting guns to DC, carrying a Smith & Wesson handgun onto the restricted grounds of the Capitol, interfering with Capitol Police, protecting the Upper West terrace of the Capitol, and also obstructing justice by threatening his son and daughter when he returned to Texas. By the way, his own son testified against him in this trial, and it is, it's really depressing. Like reading the details of the story, it's depressing. This is a guy who clearly, committed the crimes that he has now been convicted of. He is not a good person, but the damage that's done to his family, to his children, it really is heartbreaking. Reffet has not been sentenced yet. He will be sentenced on June 8th. The maximum sentence, by the way, for the most severe of his charges, which again, he's been convicted of, obstruction of Congress, carries 20 years, a potential 20 years behind bars. So he is very likely to spend quite a bit of time behind bars. And the week-long trial ended with the jury deliberating for just 4 hours before finding him guilty of all charges. I have more details, but before we get to that, Cenk.
Yeah, now remember, there's someone who already made a plea deal with the prosecutors. And he looks like he's going to get about 7 years for some serious sedition charges. So this is as serious as it gets. I mean, they're not going for just trespassing and assault. They're talking about trying to overthrow the government. That is a hell of a crime, right? And so in this case, let me give you some of his quotes. Reffet said, I'm taking the Capitol with everyone else. I think we have the numbers to make it happen. So he was literally trying to take the building. And now, look, guys, was it gonna work? Could they hold the building? And then they're now the official government? No, of course not, that's absurd, right? But that doesn't mean they weren't trying to do it. They have said on tape that that's what they were trying to do. The fact that they're unintelligent doesn't excuse their criminal behavior, right? And by the way, not so unintelligent, could it have worked? Well, how would it have worked? Remember, at the same time, there's a second branch of radicals named Steve Bannon, Peter Navarro, and Donald Trump, and they hatched a plan to institute fake electors instead of the real electors from the swing states that Biden won. So as those guys are holding the building, the idea was Pence never got to certify the election, because remember, they were chanting "Hang Mike Pence" as they were walking in. Trump riled them up to do that. So you go murder the vice president, he can't certify the election. You have the building, you put in the fake electors, then actually you could do a coup, as long as that fake elector scheme worked. So they were really trying to overthrow the United States government. And this was the dream of these militias for all of this time. And then you put in a white supremacist government that says, no, we're not doing democracy anymore, it's martial law, and white people are in charge, and that's it, period. And everybody else is gonna go back to being oppressed. Here's something else he said. Reffet later told fellow, I'm quoting Washington Post here, told fellow 3 Percenters in a Zoom call played in court that police, quote, stopped me but fired up the crowd. They couldn't be stopped after that. We all had weapons but never fired a single round. So he's bragging about having weapons. He led the charge. That's what prosecutors said and convicted him on, okay? And he broke through the police lines, even though he didn't make it at that moment. That energized everyone to push through those barricades and actually make it into the building. And the person who admits that is Guy Reffet himself. So they had him completely on all of the evidence.
So he has been behind bars since January of 2021. His own son, Jackson Reffet, turned him in and did talk about his father's involvement in the 3 Percenters. So I do want to go to his wife, right? Because this might send a message to the rest of the rioters who are facing trial. And many of them have been charged, some with far more serious charges than others. However, he refused to take a plea deal, as I mentioned, and it did not work out for him. He has been convicted of all 5 counts. And he is very likely to spend quite a bit of time in prison as a result of these convictions and as a result of him refusing to take a plea deal. Does his wife regret this decision? The answer is no. Nicole Reffet told reporters outside of the courthouse after the jury had convicted him that the fight's just begun. So she remains undeterred, okay, which is pretty terrifying, and encouraged other January 6 defendants to follow her husband's choice to not go to trial and not take plea deals from the government. She says, and I quote, "Do not take a plea deal. They want us to take a plea. They are making a point out of Guy, and that is to intimidate the other members of the 1-6ers, and we will fight together." So she's giving people, I think, pretty bad legal advice, but good. I mean, if they want to take that advice, have at it. But to me, the thing that really stands out is the lack of remorse, how unapologetic she is, how she continues to support what her husband did. Her husband threatened to kill his own children, shoot his own children. I mean, these people are so incredibly brainwashed, and like they genuinely think that they're doing something to protect American democracy, even as they're trying to overturn the results of a legitimate election.